Hey, it's the Stick Figure Historian. Welcome to episode 23 of the American series. Today, we'll be talking more about the Whiskey Rebellion. So, we might as well hurry up and get the banjo music out of the way with. Ahem. Chop chop. Well, last week, we ended with the vote taken among the Whiskey Rebels, whether they were going to stick it out and keep resisting the government tax, or accept President Washington's blanket pardon. And the poor landless guys who wanted to keep fighting won the vote. So now we're going to see how this all shakes out. By mid-September, Washington had at his bidding a force of about 13,000 men. Recruits had been rounded up from New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, which we have to remember actually included West Virginia at the time, and even Pennsylvania, from those counties that had not participated in the rebellion. It was a pretty large army, considering the population of America at the time, but few was the man among them whose heart was actually in the matter. It seems that Tully's propaganda had not quite the effect he had been hoping for. There just hadn't been enough volunteers. Most men weren't really interested in leaving their homes and families to go squash some little tax protest that they didn't even really know much about. So, the draft had been pulled out. That new power now vested in the president, thanks to the Militia Act of 1792. This turned reluctance into active rage. Anti-draft riots flared up in cities all over where officials came to gather recruits. During one of these riots in Hagerstown, Maryland, 150 people were arrested. Liberty poles were raised up again in protest, a practice which was now outlawed. 2 people that were suspected of raising a pole were arrested in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And in the violence surrounding that arrest, 2 people were killed. But in the end, the men really had no choice. They were forced to go fight against their own countrymen. Washington was busy buzzing around Pennsylvania, making sure that all the regiments were in order and wrapping up loose ends. With Hammy to tag along, of course. He had been waiting too long to miss this. Representative William Findley and another politician named David Reddick came to meet Washington and Hammy and begged them to disperse the troops. The people say they will lay down their arms. Please do not use force against them. But Washington and Hammy refused to hear the plea. They said that if they turned around now, the people would only change their minds and go right back to their violence. So Findley and Reddick were sent back west with the bad news, while Washington galloped off to Maryland to check on how things were going there. Once he had selected commanders for the various regiments, he felt his work was done. He returned to Philadelphia and left matters in their hands. Henry Lee III, known better by his nickname of Light Horse Harry Lee, was perhaps the most famous of the commanders that Washington had chosen to oversee the militias. He was a hero from the War for Independence, and the father of future Confederate General Robert E. Lee, actually. Hammy received no official military position, but he was appointed as civilian advisor, a role he was happy enough to play, so long as he got a good seat to watch the show. Which, I don't know if we can really say he was appointed. He probably got himself in that position. Kind of convenient how everything seems to be going his way, isn't it? He shifted impatiently in the saddle as they marched to Pennsylvania, feeling keenly every moment that they were losing in travel. Every moment that David Bradford could be escaping the death he had determined for him, as an object of his particular hatred. It was sometime during October that the army crossed into Pennsylvania, and as they rode through, the traces of resistance seemed to melt away before them. There was not a shot fired, not even a word of insolence. The people were sufficiently terrified. Then, on November 13th, came an event that the locals of western Pennsylvania still call bitterly the dreadful night. And indeed, it was a dreadful night. Light Horse Harry Lee ordered his men to break into the homes of the country people and arrest whoever they pleased. Yep, there goes the hero reputation, right out the window. Doors were battered in, and men hauled half-dressed from their beds as their terrified wives and children huddled against the walls, or clutched at the soldiers' clothes as they cried for mercy. The soldiers didn't even try to find out if the men were guilty or not. They didn't care. They rounded up the poor fellows into animal pens, or crammed them into basements, with no explanation of why they were being taken there. When the dreadful night was over, 150 men had been arrested in this cruel way. But David Bradford was not among those who had been dragged from their beds. He had been warned of the approach of the army, and had escaped to the far reaches of the mountains with 2,000 of his followers. And Hamilton was fuming. If they had just been a little faster, they could have wreaked full vengeance upon the insolence. Oh well, it would have to do. The captives were hauled out of the basements and herded out of the pens, and forced to march on foot all the way to Philadelphia. They didn't get there until Christmas Day. They were haggard, worn out, and starving. Some of them didn't even have shoes to wear. But there was no rest for them here. They were displayed like trophies in front of mocking crowds of Philadelphians as they were goaded through the city streets. But not everyone mocked them. Presley Neville was in the crowd there that day, and even though he himself had personally suffered at the hands of the whiskey rebels, he couldn't help but feel sorry for them when he saw how awfully they were being treated. Once this disgusting victory parade had ended, the trials were held. Out of all those 150 men, only 2, Philip Weigel and John Mitchell, were actually found guilty of breaking the law. A pretty pathetic ratio. Weigel had beat up a tax collector and burned his house down. Mitchell had participated in the raiding of the mail coaches under the command of David Bradford. The 2 were sentenced to death by hanging. And that's when Washington stepped back into the picture. He granted a pardon to Weigel and Mitchell and let them go free. And why did he do this? Well, I guess I'll let him tell you. The misled have abandoned their errors. For though I shall always think it a sacred duty to exercise with firmness and energy the constitutional powers with which I am vested, yet it appears to me no less consistent with the public good than it is with my personal feelings to mingle in the operations of government every degree of moderation and tenderness which the national justice, dignity, and safety may permit. Yeah, sounds nice and all, but nowhere in the Constitution does it say that it is the duty of the President to command his armies to drag people out of their beds in the middle of the night, without first seeing if they're actually guilty or not. The Bill of Rights actually clearly prohibits such vile behavior. See, if we zoom in here on Article 4, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Shall not be violated.
Shall not be violated.
And no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. But as bad as the dreadful night was, in the context of the past, it was a rather mild form of the crushing of a rebellion. There have been far worse things done in other countries to people who have risen against their government. It doesn't excuse any of the evil of the matter, but it is helpful to us to have perspective. The Whiskey Rebellion was over. A body of 1,200 troops was left behind in western Pennsylvania to enforce law and order until 1795. That same year, a woman named Susanna Rosen wrote a play about the event called The Volunteers. It portrayed the president and his reluctant militia as heroes who had conquered the wicked tax resistors. Washington and his wife were seated comfortably in the audience when the play came out. And yet, the government hadn't proved itself triumphant and all-powerful, as Hammy had dreamed of. It still struggled to collect the whiskey tax. There was no more violent resistance, but the tax simply remained unpaid in many states. And so this way of things continued, until Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1802. Jefferson got rid of every single tax that had been levied on the American people. During his presidency, the nation went back to only gathering income from tariffs on imports, which was quite a lot of money by that time, for trade with other countries had grown much since the very early days of the nation. The Whiskey Rebellion is a subject not often talked about, but the lesson learned from it was not lost on the backcountry farmers, and we would all do well to take heed to it now. The founding of America was not to make men free. And if you're interested in learning more about this event, I would highly recommend this book here, The Whiskey Rebellion by William Hogeland. Hogeland? Hogland? I'm very sorry if I'm not saying your name right, dude. He really gives a detailed, insightful look into what happened, and the time period in general. But that's all for now. Next week, we're going to talk about this building right here, and why everyone wants you to remember it.